August 1940. The air is heavy, humid. It carries the scent of cut grass and high-octane fuel. On a green field in Kent, a line of single-engine fighters sits silently, their curved wings catching the late summer sun. A distant drone is the only sound, a lazy insect buzz high in the hazy blue. Young men in flight gear wait. Some read, some sleep in the shade of a wing. The tension is a low, constant hum, masked by the lethargy of the afternoon. Then a distant bell shatters the calm. A scramble. Men sprint across the green. Boots pound on turf. They haul themselves into narrow cockpits, a frantic, practiced ballet of straps and buckles. Fingers find switches by memory. A cough of smoke. A catch. Then a roar, the thrum of 12 cylinders, a sound of defiance. One by one, they lift off, climbing steeply into the vast empty sky. High above, dark specks resolve into a terrifying geometry of bombers and escorts. For the young man strapped into the cockpit, survival depends not only on his skill, but on the thoroughbred fighting machine built around him. The machine was an answer to a question whispered across Europe throughout the 1930s. A question of survival. The shadow of the last war had not faded before a new one began to form, stretching from the heart of a resurgent Germany. The Treaty of Versailles, intended to secure peace, had instead sown the seeds of grievance. Adolf Hitler's rise to power was fueled by promises to restore German strength. In March 1935, he tore up the treaty's military clauses, revealing to a stunned world a new German air force, the Luftwaffe. Forged in secret, its existence was a direct challenge to the fragile European order. Britain, weary of war and grappling with economic depression, watched with growing alarm. Its own Royal Air Force was a service in transition, still flying biplanes that were relics of a bygone era. A desperate race against time began. The Air Ministry issued a series of demanding specifications for a new generation of high-speed, heavily armed monoplane fighters. The nation needed a shield. The diplomatic failures mounted. The Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia. Each concession was meant to appease, to buy time. But time was a commodity Germany was using more effectively. On September 1, 1939, the drone of Stuka dive bombers over Poland announced the end of diplomacy. Britain and France declared war. The first months were strangely quiet. An eerie hush, the press called it. The phony war. On the ground, armies stared at each other across fortified lines, but in the air the first skirmishes were fought. RAF pilots began to test their new machines, and themselves against the enemy. It was a period of vital preparation, a deceptive calm before the deluge. On May 10, 1940, the dam broke. The German war machine, the Wehrmacht, unleashed a new form of warfare. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Panzer divisions, supported by the Luftwaffe's tactical dominance, sliced through the Ardennes forest, bypassing the vaunted Maginot Line. Holland and Belgium were overrun in days. The British Expeditionary Force and the French armies were outmaneuvered, encircled. The speed of the collapse was breathtaking. France, a great military power, fell in just 6 weeks. Cornered on the coast at Dunkirk, over 300,000 Allied soldiers faced annihilation. Their only hope was the sea. Above the beaches, the RAF fought a desperate battle. Squadrons of Hurricanes and the new Spitfires flew relentless sorties from their bases in southern England, contesting the sky against a numerically superior Luftwaffe. They bought precious time for the flotilla of little ships to perform a miracle of evacuation. It was a victory snatched from the jaws of a colossal defeat, but the strategic situation was catastrophic. By late June 1940, Britain stood alone. Hitler was master of the continent, from the North Cape of Norway to the Spanish border. His gaze now turned across the 21 miles of water separating Calais from Dover. The English Channel, Britain's ancient moat, was its last physical defense, but it could only be held if the skies above it were controlled. The German plan was codenamed Unternehmen Seelöwe, Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Great Britain. It was an ambitious, complex undertaking, and its absolute prerequisite was the complete destruction of the Royal Air Force. Hermann Göring, the confident head of the Luftwaffe, promised his Führer it could be done in a matter of weeks. The fate of the free world now balanced on a knife's edge. It would be decided not by armies or navies, but by a few thousand young men in single-seat fighters. The coming battle would be a brutal calculus of machines, tactics, and industrial might. The fate of the nation would rest on the wings of its fighters and on the minds of the men who designed them. The minds behind Britain's new fighters were two of the country's finest aeronautical engineers. At Hawker Aircraft, Sidney Cam had created a rugged, dependable warhorse. His Hurricane was a pragmatic evolution of earlier biplane designs, built with traditional methods that made it quick to produce and easy to repair in the field. It was strong, stable, and armed with 8 machine guns. The Hurricane would become the unsung hero of the coming battle, the workhorse that would bear the brunt of the assault. But at Supermarine, a subsidiary of Vickers Armstrong, a different philosophy had taken shape. Its chief designer, Reginald Joseph Mitchell, was a visionary. He had forged his reputation in the crucible of high-speed air racing, winning the prestigious Schneider Trophy for Britain. His racing seaplanes were studies in aerodynamic perfection, lessons learned at the edge of performance. Mitchell, already fighting a losing battle with cancer, poured his remaining energy into a fighter design of breathtaking elegance and lethality. He would not live to see it enter service, but his legacy was a masterpiece of engineering. The Spitfire. Against them, the Luftwaffe arrayed a formidable force. Its premier fighter was the Messerschmitt Bf 109. It was a small, angular, and deadly opponent. Powered by a fuel-injected Daimler-Benz engine, it could perform negative G maneuvers that would starve a Merlin engine of fuel, a significant tactical advantage. It was fast, climbed exceptionally well, and carried a potent mix of machine guns and cannon. The Bf 109 pilot was a hunter, and he flew a Predator's machine. Supporting the 109 was the twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf 110 Zerstörer, the destroyer. Conceived as a long-range strategic fighter, it was heavily armed and versatile, but its size and weight were a handicap. Against the nimble single-engine fighters of the RAF, it would prove to be the hunted, not the hunter. The primary threat, however, was the bomber force. Formations of Heinkel, He-101s and Dornier Do 17s, escorted by fighters, were the mailed fists of the Luftwaffe. They were designed to smash airfields, factories, and ports into rubble, breaking the RAF's ability to fight. With them came the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, the infamous dive bomber. Its wailing siren was the soundtrack to the Blitzkrieg, a weapon of terror as much as destruction. But over Britain, without the total air supremacy it had enjoyed over Poland and France, it was a slow, vulnerable target. The contest would not be decided by aircraft specifications alone. Britain held a hidden advantage, a weapon the Luftwaffe barely understood. It was a complex, integrated system of air defense, conceived and built by the quiet, stubborn leader of Fighter Command, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. The Dowding system was a revolution in warfare. Its eyes were a string of coastal radar stations called Chain Home, which could detect incoming raids long before they reached Britain. Its ears were the thousands of volunteers of the Observer Corps who tracked the enemy aircraft once they were inland. This torrent of information, position, altitude, numbers, was fed into secret filter rooms. Here, plotters sifted the raw data, distinguishing friend from foe, creating a single, coherent picture of the air battle. That picture was then relayed to the operations rooms of the fighter groups and sectors. On vast map tables, controllers moved wooden blocks representing friendly and enemy squadrons. They were seeing the battle unfold in real time. From these rooms, orders were issued. Squadron leaders in their cockpits would hear a calm voice from the ground controller, vectoring them onto the enemy with unprecedented precision. It allowed Fighter Command to husband its precious and outnumbered squadrons, committing them to battle at the most effective time and place. It was a force multiplier, a technological and organizational shield for the island nation. The Luftwaffe had nothing like it. Their intelligence on British radar was poor, their understanding of the command system almost non-existent. Goering's plan was simple: seek out and destroy the RAF through overwhelming force. He believed his pilots, battle-hardened and confident, would sweep the inferior British from the skies. The stage was set for a battle of attrition, a contest between the Luftwaffe's numbers and combat experience and the RAF's integrated defense system. The system was in place, the battle lines were drawn, but victory would ultimately depend on the performance of the machines themselves, and none was more scrutinized or more celebrated than the fighter born from a racing pedigree. The fighter born from a racing pedigree was, at its core, a study in compromise. R.J. Mitchell's design was a delicate balance between speed, agility, and firepower. Its most defining feature was the wing, thin, elegant, and elliptical. This shape was no aesthetic choice. It was the most efficient aerodynamic form, creating immense lift while minimizing drag. It allowed the Spitfire to turn tighter and faster than almost any other fighter in the sky. But this elegance came at a cost. The complex curves were difficult and time-consuming to manufacture and repair, a stark contrast to the simple, straight-edged wing of its German adversary. The fuselage was a sleek, stressed-skin monocoque, a modern construction that wrapped around the aircraft's heart. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. A liquid-cooled V-12 masterpiece, it produced over 1,000 horsepower, its power harnessed by a variable pitch propeller. But its reliance on a glycol cooling system was also an Achilles heel. A single, well-placed bullet could sever a coolant line, causing the engine to seize in minutes, forcing the pilot to bail out or attempt a dead-stick landing. Its teeth were 8 .303 Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. They were calibrated to converge on a single point hundreds of yards ahead, creating a dense, shredding cone of fire. The design philosophy was clear: to give the pilot a weapon of supreme performance, a finely tuned instrument for air combat. It was not built to be simple, but to be superior. For the young men of Fighter Command, to fly the Spitfire was to form a unique bond with a machine. The cockpit was not a spacious office. It was a tight, almost claustrophobic workspace, filled with the scent of oil and metal. The pilot did not simply sit in it, he wore it. He strapped the aircraft to his back, its metal skin becoming his own. Peering over the long, curved nose, his view was of the sky, framed by the gentle curve of the elliptical wings. They became an extension of his own arms. The controls were sensitive, light to the touch, a slight pressure on the stick, a gentle push on the rudder pedals, and the aircraft responded instantly, gracefully. Pilots spoke of its impeccable manners, its lack of vice. It was a thoroughbred, forgiving of minor mistakes but capable of breathtaking performance when handled by a master. This intuitive connection built confidence, a vital psychological edge in the stress of combat. To hear the Merlin engine catch, settle into its signature smooth roar, was to hear the sound of reassurance, of power held in reserve. In the chaos of a dogfight, this bond between man and machine was everything. The Spitfire was not a blunt instrument of war, but a duelist's rapier. It moved as the pilot willed, a seamless fusion of flesh, bone, and aluminum. This intimate relationship, this deep-seated trust in the aircraft's capabilities, gave its pilots the belief that in a Spitfire, they were more than a match for anything the enemy could put in the air. In the air, theory was brutally tested by reality. The Spitfire's primary opponent, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, was a formidable and respected foe. The two aircraft were a study in contrasting tactical philosophies. The Spitfire, with its superb wing design, was the master of the horizontal fight. In a turning dogfight, it could almost always get inside the arc of a Bf 109, bringing its 8 guns to bear. RAF pilots were trained to exploit this advantage, to lure their German counterparts into a swirling, close-quarters battle. The Bf 109, however, was the master of the vertical. Its Daimler-Benz engine was fuel-injected, a significant advantage over the Spitfire's Merlin, which used a gravity-fed carburetor. If a 109 pilot pushed his stick forward into a dive, his engine kept running. If a Spitfire pilot did the same, his engine would cough and die as the negative G-force starved it of fuel. This momentary loss of power could be fatal. German pilots perfected the boom and zoom attack, diving from above, firing, and using their superior climb rate to escape. Combat became a lethal, high-speed geometry problem. Spitfire pilots learned to roll and pull through, avoiding the deadly negative G push. They learned to anticipate the dive and force the fight to turn. Each pilot had to know not just his own machine's strengths, but his enemy's weaknesses. Victory and survival depended on exploiting these fine margins, a deadly calculus played out thousands of feet above the English countryside. These starkly different capabilities would forge equally different legends in the minds of the men who flew them. These legends were forged not just in the sky, but in the heat and noise of the factory floor. An aircraft is only a weapon if it can be built, repaired, and supplied in the face of enemy action. Here, the Spitfire's elegant complexity presented a serious challenge. Its elliptical wings, while aerodynamically brilliant, required immense skill and man-hours to produce. Each rib was a different size. Each curve had to be perfect. In the desperate summer of 1940, time was a resource Britain could not afford to waste. The nation needed fighters, and it needed them immediately. The task fell to the newly appointed Minister of Aircraft Production, Lord Beaverbrook. A ruthless, tireless press baron, he brought a brutal efficiency to the problem. He bypassed bureaucracy, seized materials, and drove the factories relentlessly. But his most crucial decision was to disperse production. The main Supermarine works at Southampton were a prime target for the Luftwaffe. Under the shadow factory scheme, components were built in small workshops, garages, and even bus depots across the country. These parts were then brought to hidden assembly lines, safe from a single knockout blow. This decentralized network became the Spitfire's lifeline. When the Southampton factory was eventually devastated by bombing in September 1940, production did not stop. It faltered, but it continued, a testament to a resilient industrial strategy. The battle for Britain would be a contest of attrition, and victory depended as much on the output of these scattered, anonymous workshops as it did on the courage of the pilots. The ability to replace losses was the hidden arithmetic of survival. This arithmetic of survival dictated how the aircraft were used in combat. Air Chief Marshal Dowding was not a gambler. He was a systems manager fighting a defensive war against a numerically superior foe. He could not afford to waste his most advanced fighter in roles a simpler machine could perform. This cold logic defined the Spitfire's strategic purpose. Its primary mission was not to shoot down bombers, but to kill the fighters that protected them. The more numerous, more rugged Hawker Hurricanes were tasked with the grim, essential work of breaking up the bomber formations. This division of labor was critical. The Spitfire, with its superior high-altitude performance and a rate of climb, was the only aircraft that could consistently challenge the Bf-109 escorts. RAF controllers would vector Spitfire squadrons to climb above the main raid, seeking to engage and tie up the German fighters. This left the Hurricanes free to attack the slower, less maneuverable bombers. It was a pragmatic, unsentimental strategy. A destroyed bomber meant the loss of its entire crew of 4 or 5 trained airmen, a far greater blow to the Luftwaffe than the loss of a single fighter pilot. For the public, the Spitfire pilot was the dashing knight, dueling his counterpart in the clouds. But for fighter command, the Spitfire was a specialized tool within a larger system. It was the scalpel, used with precision to neutralize the enemy's most dangerous threat, clearing the way for the Hurricane's hammer blow. The fate of the battle rested on this carefully orchestrated, deadly synergy. This synergy was a military secret. What the world saw was the Spitfire itself, and it was an image of profound power. In an age of brutal mechanical warfare, the aircraft was a thing of beauty. Its clean, flowing lines and distinctive wing shape were instantly recognizable, a symbol of defiance against the stark, angular aggression of the Messerschmitt. The name alone, Spitfire, was perfect. It was fierce, defiant, and quintessentially British. It captured the imagination in a way the more prosaic Hurricane never could. This potent symbolism was not lost on the Ministry of Information. The Spitfire became the star of newsreels, posters, and fundraising drives. It was presented as the guardian of the nation, the silver sword defending the realm. For a public under siege, enduring the nightly terror of the Blitz, the image of a Spitfire climbing to meet the enemy was a powerful message of hope and resistance. It told them that Britain was not beaten, that it possessed the technological genius and the fighting spirit to prevail. This myth-making was a vital weapon of war. It sustained morale on the home front and projected an image of strength to the world, particularly to a still neutral United States. The Spitfire became more than a machine of war. It became a national icon, the embodiment of the few and their desperate, glorious struggle. But myths and factory numbers meant little to the men climbing into their cockpits. For them, the only reality was the approaching enemy and the opening phase of the battle that would decide everything. The opening phase began not with a thunderclap, but with a series of sharp, brutal skirmishes over the gray waters of the English Channel. Throughout July 1940, the Luftwaffe's strategy was to bleed fighter command dry. They targeted British shipping convoys, using them as bait to lure the RAF into a meat grinder over the sea. Here, the Bf-109 held an advantage. It was fighting closer to its own bases in France, while the British fighters operated at the extreme edge of their radar coverage and fuel range. For the Spitfire pilots, it was a harsh and unforgiving classroom. They confirmed the aircraft's supreme turning ability against the 109, but they also learned of its vulnerabilities. They saw Junkers Ju-87 Stukas so terrifying in the Blitzkrieg, picked apart with ease when deprived of their fighter escort. Losses were heavy on both sides. Pilots were being tested, tactics refined, in a series of swirling, chaotic dogfights that left trails of smoke and oil across the summer sky. It was a war of attrition, and Hermann Göring was confident he had the numbers to win it. On August the 13th, he unleashed the main assault. Adlertag, Eagle Day. The objective was no longer to lure, but to destroy the full might of 3 German air fleets, Luftflotten. 2, 3, and 5 was directed at the heart of fighter command. Their targets were the coastal radar stations, the forward airfields, the nerve centers of Britain's defense. The Dowding system was tested by fire. From the filter room at Bentley Priory to the sector operations rooms at Biggin Hill, Kenley, and Hornchurch, the scale of the attack became terrifyingly clear. Hundreds of enemy aircraft plotted as a single, advancing tide. Squadrons were scrambled, vectored into position by calm voices on the radio. Spitfires climbed hard, clawing for altitude to engage the high-cover Bf-109s. Below them, the Hurricanes plunged into the bomber streams. The fighting was relentless. Day after day, the raids came. Airfields were cratered, hangars burned. Ground crews worked through the night under blackout conditions to refuel, rearm, and patch up damaged aircraft. They filled bomb craters by hand, ensuring the fighters could take off at dawn. The system was bending under the strain. The radar station at Ventnor on the Isle of Wight was knocked out. The sector station at Manston was so heavily damaged it had to be abandoned. By the last week of August, fighter command was approaching a crisis point. The attrition was not in aircraft. Lord Beaverbrook's factories were replacing machines faster than they were being lost, but in men. Experienced pilots, flight leaders, and squadron commanders were being killed or wounded at an unsustainable rate. Exhausted survivors were flying 6 or 7 sorties a day. Green, barely trained replacements were being sent into combat, some with less than 10 hours of flight time on a Spitfire. They were facing the combat-hardened veterans of the Luftwaffe. Their life expectancy could be measured in minutes. The German focus on the sector stations was beginning to tell. These were the brains of the defense. Without them, the link between radar, controllers, and the pilots in the air would be severed. Britain would be fighting blind. On August 30th and 31st, the Luftwaffe mounted its heaviest attacks yet against these vital targets. Biggin Hill was hit 6 times in 3 days. Its operations room was wrecked. The infrastructure of command and control was being systematically dismantled. Dowding's shield was cracking. Then, the enemy made a mistake. On the night of August 24th, a flight of Heinkel bombers, lost in the darkness, accidentally released their payload over central London. Until now, the capital had been off-limits by Hitler's direct order. Prime Minister Winston Churchill's response was immediate and defiant. The following night, 80 RAF bombers struck Berlin. The material damage was negligible, but the psychological impact on the German leadership was immense. The Führer, who had promised the German people that their capital would never be bombed, was enraged. On September 4th, speaking at the Berlin Sportpalast, he vowed revenge. He would not just attack British cities, he would erase them. The decision was made. Göring, believing fighter command was down to its last reserves, was ordered to shift the main weight of the Luftwaffe's offensive from the battered airfields to London itself. On the morning of Saturday, September 7th, 1940, the sky over southern England was deceptively clear. The radar screens were quiet. For the exhausted pilots of No. 11 Group, it was a welcome, nerve-wracking respite. But across the channel, a force of unprecedented scale was assembling. Just after 4 p.m., the chain home stations began to report. The plots that appeared on the operations tables were unlike anything seen before. 4, then 5 massive waves of aircraft, forming up over Calais. Nearly 400 bombers, escorted by over 600 fighters, a single, colossal arrow of almost 1,000 aircraft. But the controllers watched its projected track with growing disbelief and horror. It was not aimed at the airfields of Kent or the factories of Surrey. The blocks on the map were moving past them, heading north, up the Thames estuary, on a direct and unmistakable course. The target was London. In the underground operations room at Uxbridge, the disbelief was absolute. For weeks, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park had masterfully managed the defense of his airfields. Now the enemy was simply bypassing them. He had squadrons in the air, but they were positioned too far south, anticipating another assault on the battered sector stations. By the time they could be revectored, the first German bombers were already over the docklands of London's East End. The attack was devastating. Warehouses, docks, and civilian homes erupted in fire. A vast, dark pillar of smoke rose from the city, a funeral pyre visible for miles. For the German bomber crews, it was a deceptively easy victory. Fighter opposition was scattered, disorganized. They returned to their bases in France, convinced that the RAF was on its last legs. But the decision to bomb London was a colossal strategic error. It gave Fighter Command the one thing it needed more than aircraft or pilots: a reprieve. The relentless, systematic pressure on the vital sector airfields was lifted. For one precious week, ground crews worked feverishly on open runways, repairing the infrastructure of command and control. The system, which had been on the verge of collapse, was allowed to breathe, to reset, to prepare. Göring, convinced he was delivering the final, decisive blow, planned a second great assault for a week later. Sunday, September 15th. He believed the RAF, drawn into a desperate defense of the capital, could finally be annihilated. The morning of the 15th dawned bright and clear. Just before 11 a.m., the radar plots began to appear, a large formation building over Calais. Keith Park began to commit his squadrons, holding nothing back. He sent them up in pairs, vectoring them to intercept the raid before it could reach the city. But this was only the first wave. As the battle was joined over Kent, a second, even larger formation was detected. Park now had to make a choice. He had committed his entire force. He had no reserves left. Visiting the operations room that day, Prime Minister Churchill watched the unfolding drama. He turned to Park and asked, "What other reserves have we?" The Air Vice Marshal's reply was stark. "There are none." Every single fighter in 10 and 11 Group was now in the air, climbing to meet the enemy. And for the first time, they were being joined by the controversial big wing formations from Trafford Lee-Mallory's 12 Group to the north. 5 full squadrons flying together. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe, what they saw was not a shattered and broken air force, but a sky filled with enemies. From every direction, at every altitude, Spitfires and Hurricanes swarmed them. The high-level Bf-109 escorts were swamped by Spitfires, drawn into turning dogfights where they were at a disadvantage. Deprived of their protection, the bomber formations were savaged. The disciplined German formations, the pride of the Luftwaffe, were broken apart. Heinkels and Dornier were scattered across the sky, hunted down individually by packs of Hurricanes. Pilots who had flown with impunity over Poland and France now saw their comrades exploding in fireballs around them. They jettisoned their bombs far short of their targets and fled for the relative safety of the Channel. The myth of Luftwaffe invincibility was shattering in the skies over London. A second major raid that afternoon met the same fate. The RAF, refueling and rearming with incredible speed, rose to meet them with the same ferocious intensity. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe had suffered its heaviest losses of the entire campaign. The official claims were exaggerated in the heat of battle, but the reality was undeniable. The RAF was not beaten. It was organized, deadly, and waiting for them. The psychological shock to the German High Command was profound. Göring's promise of a swift victory was exposed as a catastrophic miscalculation. 2 days later, on September 17th, Adolf Hitler quietly signed an order. Unternehmen. Seelöwe, the invasion of Great Britain, was postponed indefinitely. The invasion barges waiting in the French ports would not sail. The battle for the skies had been won, but for the people of London, a new and terrible phase of the war was just beginning. The postponement of Operation Sea Lion was a secret, known only to the German High Command. For the people of London, the battle was not over. It had merely changed its form. The Luftwaffe, defeated in the daylight, now came by night. The Blitz had begun. Night after night, the sirens wailed. The drone of unsynchronized Heinkel engines became the city's soundtrack. The world's largest metropolis became a target. The fires of September 7th were just a prelude. The docks, the factories, the Houses of Parliament, and Buckingham Palace were all hit. But so were the endless streets of ordinary homes. The objective was no longer military, but psychological. To break the will of the British people through terror. By day, the skies were quieter. The great aerial battles of August and September dwindled into smaller-scale fighter sweeps. By the end of October 1940, the Luftwaffe tacitly acknowledged its failure. The Battle of Britain was over. The cost was written in a stark and brutal ledger. Fighter Command had lost over 1,700 aircraft. More devastating was the human price. 544 pilots and aircrew had been killed. They were sons, husbands, and brothers from across Britain, the Commonwealth, and the occupied nations of Europe. Poles, Czechs, Belgians, and Frenchmen who had escaped to continue the fight. They were, as Winston Churchill had declared in the battle's darkest hour, the few. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The price for the Luftwaffe was even higher. Nearly 2,000 aircraft were destroyed. More critically, over 2,500 of its most experienced aircrew were killed or captured. These were veteran pilots and navigators, hardened in Spain and Poland, and they were irreplaceable. The myth of German air invincibility, forged in the fires of the Blitzkrieg, had been shattered against the integrated shield of Britain's defense. The victory was not the result of a single weapon or a single decision. It was the triumph of a system. It was the chain-home radar stations, peering out over the channel. It was the observer corps tracking the enemy inland. It was the plotters in the filter rooms and the calm, precise voices of the sector controllers. It was the industrial might mobilized by Beaverbrook, replacing shattered Spitfires and Hurricanes with astonishing speed. And it was the critical German error, the shift in strategy from the airfields to London, a mistake born of fury and frustration that gave Fighter Command the breathing space it so desperately needed to survive. The Spitfire had been the star, the duelist that met and mastered the formidable Bf-109. But the victory equally belonged to the Hurricane, the rugged workhorse that tore into the bomber streams, and to the ground crews who worked miracles of repair amidst the bombs and the mud. The immediate result was survival. The threat of invasion, the most profound existential crisis to face the island nation in centuries, was gone. The fires still burned in London, Coventry, and Plymouth, and a long, dark war lay ahead. But Britain would not be conquered. It would fight on. The island had been saved, but its survival had now fundamentally altered the entire strategic map of the war. The alteration of that map was profound and permanent. By failing to subdue Britain, Hitler was now forced to confront the strategic nightmare that had haunted German planners for a generation, a two-front war. His gaze turned east, towards the Soviet Union and the vast plains he coveted for Lebensraum. In June 1941, he would launch Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. But he would do so with his western flank unsecured. The Luftwaffe, weakened by its losses over England, would be stretched thin across a continent. The experienced pilots lost in 1940 would be desperately missed in the skies over Stalingrad and Kursk. For the Allies, Britain's survival transformed the island from a fortress under siege into a forward base for the liberation of Europe. It became, in the words of one general, an unsinkable aircraft carrier. From its airfields, the RAF's Bomber Command, soon to be joined by the mighty U.S. 8th Air Force, would launch a relentless strategic bombing campaign against the industrial heart of Germany. It was from these same ports and fields that the forces for the D-Day landings would one day assemble. The victory in 1940 made the victory of 1944 possible. The psychological impact was just as significant. The Battle of Britain was the first time the German war machine had been stopped. The aura of invincibility, cultivated through a string of stunning victories, was broken. For the occupied peoples of Europe, listening to the BBC on clandestine radios, the news from the skies over England was a flicker of hope in a continent of darkness. It proved resistance was not futile. It proved the Reich could be beaten. This new reality also resonated across the Atlantic. In the United States, still clinging to neutrality, Britain's defiance was a powerful argument. The image of the Spitfire, a technologically superior machine holding the line against tyranny, helped sway public and political opinion. The Lend-Lease Act of March 1941, which provided massive material aid to Britain, was a direct consequence of the nation proving it could survive and fight. The battle also became a crucible for technological evolution. The Spitfire of 1940 was a brilliant design, but it was not perfect. Combat exposed its weaknesses. The carburetor that failed under -G. The armament of 8 rifle-caliber machine guns that sometimes lacked the hitting power to bring down a tough German bomber. The arrival of a new and deadly German fighter in 1941. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 threatened to make the Spitfire obsolete overnight. But the design had a genius for growth. Engineers at Supermarine and Rolls-Royce worked relentlessly. A new 2-stage supercharger for the Merlin engine dramatically improved high-altitude performance. The original 8 machine guns were replaced with a devastating combination of 4 20mm cannons. The airframe was strengthened, the aerodynamics refined. The Spitfire Mark V gave way to the Mark IX, an aircraft that could meet and master the FW-190. Later, the mighty Rolls-Royce Griffon engine would be fitted, creating variants of immense power and speed that served through to the end of the war and beyond. The fight for Britain was not an end, but a beginning. It was the moment the Spitfire entered the global consciousness, a symbol of a nation's finest hour. The legend was born in the summer of 1940, but it was forged in the fires of the long war that followed, a continuous process of refinement that transformed a brilliant fighter into an enduring icon. That enduring icon would serve in every theater of the war, its distinctive silhouette becoming a familiar sight over the deserts of North Africa, the besieged island of Malta, and the jungles of Burma. It would be adapted, upgraded, and pushed to the limits of its design, a constant presence in the long, grinding fight towards victory. When the guns finally fell silent, the Spitfire's purpose shifted. The weapon became a relic. The instrument of war became a symbol of peace, Most were scrapped, their elegant aluminum recycled for a world rebuilding itself. But a few survived, lovingly maintained by a new generation, preserved as living history. To see a Spitfire fly today is to witness something more than a vintage aircraft. It is a memorial in flight. The shape of the wing, a perfect ellipse against the clouds, is a reminder of R.J. Mitchell's genius. The sound of the Merlin engine, that deep, resonant roar, is an echo of the voices of the few, a sound that once gave hope to a nation listening from below. It remains a profound paradox, a machine of exquisite beauty, designed for the brutal, violent work of killing. It was not a simple tool, hammered out for a single purpose. It was the product of inspiration, a fusion of art and engineering that gave its pilot an edge born not just from horsepower, but from confidence. The Spitfire did not win the war alone. No single machine ever does, but it became the embodiment of the struggle. It stands as a testament to a moment when a nation, pushed to the very edge of existence, found its defiance embodied in the graceful lines of a fighting machine. A superb instrument of survival, born of necessity, and destined for legend.